Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Applying the Minneapolis Method for Ranked Choice Voting Election Testing, Audits, and Hand Counts. The webinar will begin shortly. My name is Chris Hughes, and I'm a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center consulting team. I will be your moderator for today's session. First, we need to cover a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees with us today. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. To expand or minimize the control panel, click the orange arrow of your webinar taskbar. If you have a question or comment regarding the webinar, please type that message in the question box. To keep this webinar to about 45 minutes and out of respect for your time, there will only be a brief question and answer session at the end. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website in 1 to 2 weeks. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center provides a compilation of best practices and first-hand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting. The website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, and the overall project serve as resources for voters, election administrators, policymakers, candidates, and more. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center team is not advocacy focused. Rather, we aim to provide resources that allow jurisdictions to implement ranked choice voting effectively and efficiently. With extensive elections experience and working together overseeing statewide, municipal, and district RCV elections, our team has focused on expanding the resources and information available regarding the administration of and education about this voting method. We are available to discuss whether or not RCV is an option for your jurisdiction and to assist in developing implementation plans, processes for tabulating results, voter education, and more. Our services are free, including travel. Now, Connie Schmidt, an election consultant with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center who has helped Minneapolis with their RCV implementations in 2013 and 2017, will introduce today's presenter.
Thanks, Chris. Grace is Assistant City Clerk, Director of Elections for the City of Minneapolis, which is the third largest election jurisdiction within the state of Minnesota. She has a total of over 25 years of experience in election administration and has been their director there in Minneapolis since 2012. As Chris noted, it's been my privilege to work with Grace during the past two ranked choice voting elections there in 2013 and again in 2017. I've always been so impressed because her motto has always been to make Minneapolis the gold standard in ranked choice voting election administration. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome Grace to the webinar today to share some of the details about managing ranked choice voting elections in the city of Minneapolis.
Thank you, Connie. What a nice introduction. Can everyone see my screen? Let me just click right now. I see this, show my screen. So hopefully everyone can see my screen right now. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about how you could use the Minneapolis method of hand counting to administer a RCV election for testing, audits, and hand counts. Now,
Grace,
what I really want,
sorry to interrupt you, but we're seeing your notes portion too, so we're not seeing the full screen.
Oh, thank you. Oh.
Take it away.
All right, thank you, Karen, for that technical glitch. As I was saying, my focus today is to actually talk to the election administrators. I know that there's a lot of concerns on how to administer and execute it from the back end as far as testing and audits, etc. And so hopefully through this presentation, you'll have a better understanding and hopefully allay some of those concerns. As Connie indicated, she did assist us in Minneapolis for the 2013 and 2017 election. And as we started talking back in 2013 about the technical processing of ranked choice voting, Connie had commented that she felt like her eyes were glazing over and she wanted to crawl under the table. And I know that's the impression that many may have. But as we walk through it step by step, you're going to find out that it's not that difficult. You have a strong foundation of resources and tools, and also the fact that we now have an automated tabulating system. So there's a lot of positives, and hopefully that you'll agree with that as we move forward. So just a little quick as far as the background of Minneapolis. We did, the voters did approve using ranked choice voting in 2006, with the first election in 2009, a full hand count, and then again in 2013 and 2017. And 2017, I just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that it also illustrates how big the city of Minneapolis is. We administered the election with 132 precincts. We had over 105,000 ballots to tabulate. We did it with a combination of utilizing software and manual tabulation, and we did it in 11 and a half hours. And you also have to remember it's very unique because we're one of the few local jurisdictions that have all offices on the ballot, namely 22 offices once every 4 years. So, how you handle this? We need to overcome some of the potential challenges that may occur. So when you are starting to look at implementing it, the first and foremost thing that you need to remember is that ranked choice voting is just a different method of tabulating votes. Your basic election administration still applies. The key is to identify where the law is silent or perhaps too prescriptive that may limit or require modified application to the ranked choice voting methodology. So here in Minneapolis, the primary challenge is our inability to use the tabulating software with algorithms and formulas until the EAC updates their standards. So that right from the get-go, we know that we had to be creative. Secondly, the state of Minnesota is very silent on anything to do with ranked choice voting, and yet very prescriptive on how the ballot is laid out. So we were restricted as far as how we can formate that ballot. So those were some of the things that we had to kind of look at. And one thing that I wanted to point out here with the continuity of institutional knowledge, to kind of lay your fears that been there, done that, so to speak. The city clerk, Casey Carl, started in 2010. I didn't start with the city of Minneapolis until 2012. Neither one of us had a clue on what ranked choice voting was, much less administer it. So we had to start from scratch, so to speak, in learning and educating ourselves. However, the team that implemented it in 2009 was incredible in documenting every detail of it, so we had a foundation. And I think that's one of the reasons why we provide so much of our information on the website, is that so anyone who wants to implement it, to share that knowledge, so no one has to start from scratch and figure out how to do it on their own. You have resources, not only from us on the web, but organizations just like the Ranked Choice Voting Center. They have a lot of good information for you as well. So, what does that mean? This is what our ballot looks like. In 2017, we have ES&S as our vendor. We use the DS200 ballot scanner tabulator. And as you can see that this is a two-sided ballot, it's very compact. And because of that, we only have the ability to use 3 rankings. So, from the beginning, I'm going to go through this step by step. As you implement it for the first time, there are some fundamental rules that you need to really evaluate in the tabulation process before you can go any further. And here are some basic concepts that you need to address. The first one is threshold. And we define threshold as the votes cast for the office divided by seats to fill plus 1, plus 1, disregarding fractions. So as you can see by the formula, it's basically 51. Now, the key to that is we feel that it's easier to refer to our tabulation process by comparing it to a standard static number, meaning when we determine how many votes it is, that is where we try to tabulate to determine a winner. We don't worry about the percentages from thereafter. The percentage is already there. We go forward with a static number. Voter intent is another area in which you need to take a look at, whether it is how a voter ranked, whether there was any mistakes in voting all three rankings, skipped, etc., or when you are actually counting the physical ballots, how do you account for those marking errors? We're going to go into a little bit more detail with voter intent and write-ins and batch elimination. I'm not going to go into much detail, but you need to consider how your jurisdiction handles write-ins. Do you have to tabulate every individual person who is written in? Can you eliminate all of them? You have to make that policy decision. And then with batch elimination, it deals with if you have candidates that it is mathematically impossible for them to even win, can you eliminate them all at once, or do you have to go through candidate by candidate? So we're going to start off with the ranking of voting, ranking definitions, and how to handle that particular voter intent. It could be when an individual votes two individuals in the same ranking, overvote, or bullet voting, which is sometimes referred to with repeat candidates, where they fill in the oval for all rankings for one person. They may skip a ranking. They may forget to vote on a ranking. And then at the bottom is just, this is voter intent, meaning the machine can't tell what's the voter intent. So with that, I will describe how we do it in Minneapolis. First and foremost, I want to say we use voter intent for rankings. Sometimes it's called normalization. Sometimes it's called voter error accounting. We prefer to use voter intent. It's more positive and respectful to our voters. And really, ultimately, what are you doing? You're trying to determine the intent of the voter on how they mark their ballot. So, for example, for overvote, you can have various scenarios depending upon where the overvote is. But our philosophy through the whole ranking chart is to enable the voter as best as possible the opportunity to have their ballot counted. So, for example, in overvotes, if the first choice is an overvote, they voted for candidate A and B, instead of eliminating or exhausting that ballot, we actually go to the second choice, and that second choice becomes their first choice, as you can see in this column here. So it would be candidate C, candidate D, and then the third choice would be blank. The same thing with repeat candidate. Again, we'll see where the duplication is, and we just go to the next rankings to make sure that they have that opportunity, as well as skipped. As you can see, for example, in the first example, if they forget to mark the first one, but they made choices in the second and third, excuse me, then their choices become first A, and then B. So, with that basic concept, we are committed to do the tabulation without the automated process because we were prohibited to doing it. So with Minneapolis method, we had to get creative. And so what we do is we try to leverage what technology we have, and that's with an Excel spreadsheet in which it's kind of like a virtual screen of moving ballots per se, and you'll understand that as we go through this, of but just using basic functions, addition, subtraction, cut and paste, and sort. And so as you'll see, basically each row in an Excel spreadsheet is a ballot, and it's a matter of moving those rows from one to another. And if you want more details on how that is, we certainly have all that information on our website. So this is where people get glazed over. Charts like this. Actually, what we do is we do basic sorting. You look at the first candidate, pile it up, and then with one candidate, you look at their second choice, and you continue piling it so that you have a visual like this. This, I think, would be it's easier for you to see. First choice are by the major candidates, and then by candidate, you break it down by where their second and third choices are. So for Buford, this particular combination, Buford, Carter, Arness, there was actually 30 ballots. So this looks a lot simpler than the complex charts that you may have seen in the past. With that, we data enter it into a spreadsheet. And as I mentioned, each combination is one row. And then we start with the tabulation process, which again may look very complex with all the arrows, yes and no. But basically, you enter the data, you sort it, you determine the threshold. Can an office be declared with a winner? If yes, you're done. If not, you start the process of eliminating. We have two teams working concurrently to make sure that it's accurate, and then transfer it. And again, is there a winner or not? If not, you go through the whole process. This is a summary of that process. You can see that McIntosh was a losing candidate. Again, we work with numbers, not percentages. So his 277 ballots were reallocated, which gave a grand total that Fireside actually won. What I'd like to talk about now is the cast vote record, which was developed in 2013. So first ranked choice election that I had to execute, not only did I have to understand it, but we actually had to implement new improvements, which was extremely helpful. Long story short, with the cast vote record, a report is generated that actually ties the rankings per office, per ballot, which actually eliminates doing that hand count tabulation and entry. So with that, all we had to do is clean the data, which I'll show you shortly, because it can be exported into an Excel file. And then we continue on with the normal tabulation process that you saw in the Excel spreadsheet video. This is an example of what a cast vote record looks like. It comes in an Excel spreadsheet, and our write-ins, as you know, the DS200 ballot scanner, meaning the write-ins are actually scanned in images. And so we have to clean the data by actually deleting the image and replacing it with actually the candidate's name, if you have to count write-ins, or with us, we replace it with UWI as undeclared write-in. And to note, each ballot is identified by the number, and then we also do the sorting by, alphabetizing each of the candidates. So it looks like this. So all the Bryant squares are sorted together, et cetera, and you can see down here at the bottom, the one that we had to replace the two write-ins shows up as UWI. So with that basic understanding, where do we go from there? You may be able to use the automatic tabulation software, but you still have to have a method of how to test it using manual or documentation to prove that the tabulation is accurate or whatever process you have is accurate and secure. So normally what you do is your logic and accuracy testing. You're going to need to do post-election reviews, and God forbid, the recounts. But as I mentioned, everything we have is on our website, including those data files, including all our past elections, so that you can replicate those test decks, those pre-marked ballots, so that when you go through and verify that the machine does read the ballots correctly, you can verify that each candidate that's selected comes out on the results tape, that it does calculate it. You can also compare your pre-marked desk deck to the cast vote record to make sure that the ballots, that the report actually ties the correct choices on each of the ballots. And you can even verify the results, the ultimate predetermined result, by using the automatic tabulated software. So that is pretty basic. And like I said, all the materials are there, so that'll help you. The post-election review and the recounts may be a little bit more tricky because you are actually working with the actual ballots, and you do have to hand sort. But there are ways in which you can expedite it using the cast vote record. For example, before I get into that, this is where the voter intent chart works as far as identifying how to handle the various markings. And this is a standard guideline in the state of Minnesota. So not only do we have to evaluate the ranking discrepancies, we also have to take into consideration errors or markings that the machine cannot read, but by visually looking at the ballot, we can see the intent of the voter in these various scenarios. So using that, we set up tables. Typically, you can have up to 3 teams, where there are teams of 2, where you go through that piling system and sort so that you actually come up with the summary statement again, where Becker, Wheeler, and Becker, for example, had 7 ballots. We have a spreadsheet that is generated that has all the cast vote record counts from the machines, as well as all potential combinations. As you can see on this particular slide, the machine has certain counts for certain combinations, and we also include combinations that weren't counted to verify that through voter intent it may occur. So in that previous example, here, it is entered here, and it's the same as what the cast vote record shows. Handling voter intent, it would look like this. For example, this one, a write-in, John Edwards, and an undervote, the machine read 1, but upon examining the ballot, it wasn't the case. This was not really truly for John Edwards. Conversely, this one, we knew that John Edwards was actually a choice by the voter, didn't fill in the bubble, so it added. So even though there's a discrepancy, it's still balanced because it was explainable. Lastly, I'd like to talk about recounts. I actually experienced a recount for the first time in 2017, which was challenging but fulfilling in order to be able to apply the concepts I already knew and have a successful recount. First and foremost, this was for Council Member Ward 6. It was a very intense race between 2 candidates. We had canvassed the declaration of Warsami, Abdi Warsami, as the winner. with 3,629 votes, and his competitor, Mohammed Noor, had 3,390 votes. Now, the losing candidate requested a recount. It did not meet our standards for a publicly funded recount. Therefore, Mr. Noor had to provide a bond to cover the cost to administer this recount. And he did indeed provide a bond. Another part of the Minnesota law is that in this type of scenario, the challenger may choose 3 precincts first to determine if there's enough variances to proceed or not. So this slide shows that he had selected precinct 2, precinct 3, and precinct 7. And these were the results of our hand count. In 2, voter intent, Rasami was 1 less. Precinct 3, there was variances. And in precinct 7, there was 1 variance due to that voter intent of how a voter marked the actual ballot. So in summary, you can see he knew it was not needed to proceed. One of the things that we did is prior to the recount, we actually put the data files online. So he knew what potential options he had. And he knew that after counting 3,595 votes, 3 precincts, it really, grand total was only a minor discrepancy here. So he seceded and withdrew from the proceedings, and Abdi Ursami was elected as a council member. So that is where I'm at. I hope that this presentation was helpful, that you feel a little bit more comfortable with how to actually execute a ranked choice voting tabulation process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Grace, for this insightful presentation. Just so everyone knows, today's webinar has been recorded and we'll hold a brief question and answer session in a few seconds. The recording and supplemental Q&A document will be added to our webinar series archives on our website in the next couple of weeks. We'll also be sure to include a link to that video we saw earlier in the presentation. I'm going to right now leave up Grace's contact information, but towards the end of the presentation, I'll take control of the screen back over so you can see the Resource Center contact information, but I want to leave Grace's up for now in case people want to copy that down. So let's move on to the Q&A segment. We've got a couple questions coming in. Let me pull those up. So the first one is, I think, relatively straightforward. Steve Chesson asks, does the law limit you to 3 rankings on the RCV ballots?
No, it does not. It's real estate. Because of the number of candidates and the number of races, plus being very prescriptive in our law as far as the size of font and how to, well, actually, the key one is the fact that right now our current law says that the oval has to be next to each candidate's name. So those are the limitations we have, that in order to get everything on one ballot, 3 is the max we can do.
Right, and I know that St. Paul does 6 rankings, right? But they do it in 2 rows, is that right?
That is correct, and the difference between St. Paul and Minneapolis is the number of races. As I mentioned, we're unique. We have our municipal elections once every 4 years for all. Typically, most jurisdictions stagger it, half one cycle, and then the next cycle is the other half. That is the case with the city of St. Paul, so they have more flexibility because they don't have as many races on the ballot.
Okay, well, and that leads into another question I was having. What is the maximum number of ranked choice voting ballots or ranked choice voting races a person will have on their ballot in Minneapolis?
Well, the maximum currently is 3. Pending legislation, the approval of voting standards, new technology, etc., we would like to expand it. However, I don't want to get into detail because I'm not well attuned as far as the documentation, but from my understanding, the general practice is approximately up to 6 choices. Yeah, because you'll find people drop off. And so we would like to have that flexibility in the future to expand it at least up to 6.
Right. Well, and we know from our work with the Center for Civic Design, the resource centers work with them, that voters tend to cluster around 5 to 8 rankings. That's what they feel comfortable with, especially when they're new to ranked choice voting.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Let me see what else. We've got questions flooding in now. Let me see what we should ask next. Well, here's one. We were wondering what sort of review process did the spreadsheet that you all use for your semi-manual tabulation go through before it was used in 2013?
Oh, you went through exhaustive. Actually, in 2009, they did a lean process, and that's how they came up with the Minneapolis method. And through that, they used, boy, I know it was very extensive, and I'm going to stop there because it was before my time. I just know that the individuals working on it, I have to say, were brilliant. They really came up with a system that was tried and true, and so many checks and balances and security measures to prevent any human error with the manual calculation of cutting and pasting, and a clear paper trail, so to speak, as far as every step. They're checked in and checked out of a system where each process is actually a snapshot. So you can actually go back and see where an error would be, or to reaffirm there were no errors. I wish I could tell you more.
Sure. Yeah. And it is clearly a very advanced sort of spreadsheet. I wrote down in my notes extreme spreadsheeting, which is a joke we make at Fair Vote sometimes about the sort of work we do.
Well, we had to get creative because we have to do it manually. So we had to leverage as much as possible. And for those listening, that is available. And we are more than happy to provide that spreadsheet that can be modified for each of the jurisdictions that are interested. So they don't have to recreate the wheel.
Right, of course. And well, we appreciate all the work that Minneapolis has put in to make things easier for people interested in ranked choice voting. A question about recounts. Somebody says, I'm leery of variance in recounts. Do you think automated tabulation might help lower the incidence of variation in recounts?
It really depends upon each jurisdiction's application and interpretation of a recount. Recounts in the state of Minnesota means you have to actually manually hand count and take into consideration the markings on the ballot or voter intent. And that's where you're always going to see the variance. And it's accepted best practice that you're always going to have that slight variance. But overall, it really does not impact the end result. So,
right. Well, it's the sort of thing you see when people start looking at ballots as opposed to computers. Like people and computers will always see different things at edge cases.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know. You can certainly retabulate it. I am unable to answer that question because I've never experienced tabulation and may not for a long time.
Well, that leads into my next question. What are your Minneapolis's plans for the 2021 ranked choice voting elections you guys have?
We're crossing our fingers. Our state requires that tabulation software has to meet the minimum standards as provided through the EAC. and until the EAC updates and approves new standards for voting equipment, we're kind of in a holding pattern. So I may be doing it the hard way, where my colleagues will be fortunate enough to do it the easier way with tabulation. There is a slight possibility that we could try it as a pilot, but we're just crossing our fingers, and we'll be prepared for whatever is thrown our way.
Right, exactly. All right, well, that is all of the big questions we've got submitted so far. We'll be sure to answer any other questions we receive after the presentation or any that we may have missed in this Q&A session in our follow-up document that we'll release in the next couple of weeks. And thanks so much to Grace for joining us today and presenting for on this webinar.
Thank you.
And if you want to learn more about Minneapolis ranked choice voting elections, listen to the September episode of RCV Clips, Voter-Focused Ranked Choice Voting in Minneapolis. Or check out the Minneapolis Elections website at vote.minneapolismn.gov. Thanks.